Good morning, everybody. Nice to see so many people. Thank you for joining today's session. Lovely to have you all here. My name's Jane. I'm Head of Support here at Scribe. So just to introduce ourselves, some of your clerks may already use Scribe, or you may have just heard of us. Scribe's a software company. We provide accounting, bookings and cemetery software and currently work with over 700 town and parish councils across England and Wales. So here at Scribe, we like to not only provide free training to our existing customers, but to everyone in the town and parish community. So I'm joined here today by Jo, our Customer Success Manager here at Scribe. Give us a wave, Jo. There she is. So prior to joining Scribe, Jo's been a town and parish clerk for the past 15 years. She's also Silca qualified and still a clerk to 3 rural parishes. I'm also joined by Hannah, our head accountant. Where are you, Hannah? There you are. Who's been answering everyone's accounting questions here at Scribe for the last 3.5 years. She's also been instrumental in developing our training programs and is here today to answer any questions that you may have around the budgeting process. So we will be stopping to answer your questions during the presentation. If I could ask that you remained on mute, but if you could pop any questions you do have in the chat box at the bottom, and then I can read those out to Jo and Hannah as we move through the presentation. So without further ado, over to you, Jo.
Thanks very much, Jane. Hello and welcome to today's session. So I'm going to talk to you today about the budget and your role within this process. So what is budgeting? A budget is a financial plan for a period of time, usually 1 year in town and parish councils. Parish councils, regardless of their size, have a statutory duty to prepare an annual budget in order to set their precept. The precept is the proportion of the council tax bill that the town or parish council charges their local electors to meet their budget requirements. As I've mentioned at the bottom of this slide, it is very important that all council members understand the budget process. Your clerk RFO is responsible for preparing the annual budget, but some council members may also be involved, such as those who form part of a finance committee. It's essential, however, that all council members understand not only their budget, but also its importance and why it's key to have a sound budget to follow and monitor as you go through the financial year. So why is budgeting important and what's your role within all this? Budgeting is so important to get that right precept amount. It's also, sorry, I'm just having a little bit of a technical issue here. I really apologise. Sometimes when you're using 2 screens, I do apologise about that. Budgeting is important to get the precept amount. It's also an opportunity to look at the overall running of its finances and ensure the precept amount to be requested is adequate, taking into account all expected expenditure and any income for the following year. The budget process is essential to control the council's finances. A councillor's role within this is to oversee the council's finances and demonstrate they will have sufficient income to meet its objectives and carry out its activities and services. Councillors should consider the council's priorities and objectives and ensure these drive the budget process. Your involvement will also assist with decision making in these aspects of the budget. Consideration should also be given to any future projects, and budgeting allows you to consider what future spend for these projects might be. So these can be included within the budget. Good budgeting also assists in identifying any overspends or underspends and allows for these to be considered whilst preparing the budget. You may have had some underspends in items such as hall hire due to COVID, but in other areas there may have been some overspends such as insurance renewal and grass cutting, and this is the perfect time to take an overall look at these items and review how they should be managed going forward. The budgeting timetable. So your clerk will normally start preparing your annual budget during November for it to be approved by January, so the precept amount can be submitted to the billing authority ready for the new financial year in April. This is a rough guideline, but each council will have their own timetable to work to. As I mentioned, your clerk will normally start preparing the annual budget around November. If your council has committees, sometimes separate budgets may be prepared for these, and these also may be approved by the relevant committee ahead of the main budget and precept setting meeting. Most councils consider their budget between November and January. Some larger councils may spread this item over a few meetings, so councillors have a bit longer to consider what is being proposed. So does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask me at this point, please?
So if you've got any questions, if you'd like to pop them in the chat, we can put those to Jo or Hannah. So no questions at the moment, Jo, so if you want to.
Thanks, Jane, thank you. So budgeting approaches. I'm going to give you some examples today on some different types of budgeting approaches that your council could take. The first type is incremental budgeting. This is commonly the most traditional method of budgeting. It's when a percentage is added to all budget headings in order to forecast for the following year. This kind of budgeting is fairly straightforward, but could also prove to be less accurate. What you will need to consider if you choose to use incremental budgeting method are any items that are fairly static with not a lot of change, along with those other items where you can expect a percentage increase. You may have items such as repairs or maintenance where it is more difficult to budget because you simply just don't know what you're going to spend. You will need to take a little bit of a different approach for these. Sometimes it could be useful if your clerk obtains some quotations for work ahead of the budget to get a better idea of what the expected spend on certain items might be. Zero-based budgeting. You may also choose to use a zero-based budgeting method. This is where basically you start from scratch with a blank piece of paper. This method is normally used if you just want to start again and build your budget upon what the account needs to achieve. For example, a project or services that you wish to provide, these may be existing or in some cases completely new. This type of budgeting is good for those councils that just need to start afresh with their budget or even just with certain sections of it. As zero-based budgeting can be useful for these one-off projects such as a play park refurbishment where there wouldn't have been a previous budget, but the project still needs to be built in along with its projected costs and any income that may be received. Forecasting. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about forecasting and where this comes into the budget process. If you're going to use incremental budgeting, you will need a forecast because you will need to look at the remaining spend for this financial year in order to forecast for the following year. There will be some budget headings that will be easier to forecast than others, and it's best to go down line by line, committee by committee, if relevant, and ensure that the forecasting figure for each item is adequate. If as a councillor you feel that the amount forecasted for any particular item isn't adequate, it's essential that you raise this with your clerk or the relevant committee. If there has been overspends or underspends, that particular budget heading could have room for adjustments. Forecasting is based upon assumptions and estimates, as you will never get it exactly right, but that's fine. But what must be considered is that the council has forecast correctly for the future year's expenditure in order to get that accurate precept amount. I've also noted that forecasting can also be used in conjunction with historic data. So it may be necessary that you go back and review previous years in respect of some budget items. So how do you forecast? Some councils have regular quarterly or half-yearly updates presented to them by their clerk, but forecasting can be done really from any month end. The council needs to take into consideration the following: current year's spending levels for ongoing services which it's responsible for, such as recreation facilities, lighting, cemeteries, insurance, and office costs. Costs of any additional spending plans or projects also need to be taken into consideration, along with the provision for contingencies and also your reserves. It is important that levels of anticipated income from services which the council are responsible for, such as any rental income, allotment fees, burial fees, are also reviewed as part of your overall budget process. So you will see here that we have an example of a final forecast and proposed budget for the new year. Looking at our staff costs, we can see that we budgeted £9,000 with actual payments to half year of 4,678, and forecasted £750 for the remaining months, giving us a total predicted spending of £9,178. To the right, we have proposed budget being £9,180, being a 2% increase to the 21-22 budget. Looking at electricity, we can see here that we have already spent £345 with forecasted figures remaining high at £60 per month, giving an expected spend of £705. We all know dreaded electricity prices will remain high, so I've calculated that next year's budget will be £700 and noted that the price has increased. It is possible, of course, that you may have underspent on your budget. My hall hire was budgeted at £400, but due to COVID, it wasn't used for the first half of the year. Therefore, my forecast for next year will still remain high at £400. So again, really, it's looking at your budgets line by line, identifying the actual spend so far, creating that forecast against the current budget, then seeing where you are. Have you underspent or overspent? And what are the reasons for those over or underspends? What do you need to consider for the future? Scribe do offer a free budgeting spreadsheet and would be more than happy to send this to you. And you can drop us an email to hello@scribeaccounts.com and we'll forward this over to you. If you are already a Scribe user, then forecasting it comes as part of the software package. So does anybody have any questions they would like to ask me at this point, please? Anything about the spreadsheet at all?
So just to say, actually, we will send the spreadsheet. We'll send out copies of the slides and the recording after this session. And we do actually include a copy of the spreadsheet as well for anyone that would like it.
Yeah.
Now, Kevin's asked, how's the precept set?
Oh, so that's a bit later on in my presentation. So if you don't mind, to cover that part then, because there's quite a detailed part in the precept. So I'll be more than happy to ask any questions at the end about the precept. I do go into quite a lot of detail about your precept setting. So if that's okay, Kevin.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jo.
I think James has a question, Jane.
Oh, you're waving at me, James. Sorry.
Yeah, hi. Thank you. As an individual councillor, can you request something individually? Do you have to get full council approval?
No, so if you've got something that you'd like to be included in the budget, you can request that, definitely, and then your clerk can put an email out, or you could put an email out to the whole council suggesting what you would like to go in the budget for consideration.
But do they still, does it still at some stage, could it be overruled, for instance, or does it still need full council approval or clerk approval?
Yes, anything that goes into the budget will require overall council approval when you approve your budget. Okay. So it's best probably to speak to your chairman or are you the chairman, James?
No,
you're a councillor. So yeah, it's best to have a chat with your chairman, have a chat with your clerk, ask them about recommending something to be included in the budget, and then hopefully that'll all go in and you can sit with the clerk and the chairman and put in some figures, and then when it goes to full council, that item will be included.
That's great, thank you.
No, you're welcome.
So
is there any more questions at this point?
No, I can't see more questions. I can't see one waving, Jo. So yeah.
Okay, we'll move on. So the budget process. The overall budget process, as previously mentioned, is a review of the current year's spending and any income received. By preparing a sound budget, it gives the council an opportunity to determine correct spending plans. This is so important. We are now going to look at some important elements of the budget process. Some of these budget headings and lines are going to be harder to budget for than others. So the first important element is your expenditure. This will most likely be the main part of your budget. You will need to make some basic assumptions. You will have what we call fixed or indirect costs, and these are costs that are unlikely to change, such as staff costs and phone contracts, and they're fairly easy to budget for. Other costs may be known, for example, such as insurance, especially if you are tied into a 3-year undertaking, which commonly some councils can be. Other costs may require a percentage uplift to be applied. You will then also have to think about your reactive and variable costs, which are harder to predict, such as maintenance. This is where you'll need to make some assumptions, such as how old is the item that you're budgeting for, what maintenance it may require going forward, and these items generally do form a smaller proportion of the overall budget for a council, but need looking at quite carefully. When councils are looking at their expenditure items, it's always a good idea to consider what income comes in against items. So, for example, the village hall may require a new boiler, but the village hall bookings may have risen over the past few years. So this work may not require such a huge amount to be budgeted for, as some of the expenditure may be able to come from the extra income received. But then again, the extra hall bookings might require some additional cleaning. So this is where the overall picture really needs to be taken into account when you're looking at your budget. Income. Some councils don't have very much income except for items like bank interest, even though these days it isn't very much. But if you're lucky enough to have some guaranteed income, such as allotment fees, hall hire, market rents, then this income does need to be taken into consideration during the overall budgeting process. I would suggest that the effects of COVID are still taken into account, as some of your guaranteed income sources, unfortunately, may still be affected going forward. When councils look at their anticipated budget for income, it is essential, however, that consideration is given to items such as cemetery income, as this income is not guaranteed and therefore it can prove hard to predict. Contingencies. This is where councils budget for those unexpected projects. And I would most certainly recommend that councils should consider having a contingency pot, however big or small, within their budget, as you never know what one-off expenditures may crop up. One of my previous councils, in which I was clerk, were notified the post of their village sign, which had been in place for several years, had gone rotten. This was something that could not be ignored, and due to the council not budgeting for this item, these costs then came out of that all-important contingency pot. If the council had not budgeted for contingencies, however, these costs would then have had to come out of their reserves. So moving on to reserves. This is about projects that you want to achieve. The main thing to think about with these kinds of projects is their income. So is the council going to receive grant funding to assist achieve the project, or do some costs towards this project need to be built into the budget? You will also need to think about expenditure and what the overall cost of the project will be, along with any future maintenance costs required. The other thing to consider is projects that have taken place over previous years, and if these are going to require ongoing maintenance too, such as if a new play park has now been installed, then what are the ongoing and the direct costs for this project going to be? There could be annual inspections, maintenance to carry out, and all this must be considered. It might be also that there's been a deferred project, and this project may have been delayed due to COVID. These project costs may need to be revalued, as costs may have gone up, and this will need to be taken into account, as the council may now require more time to build these costs into their budget. It is important for councils to understand their reserves and what funds are kept within these, as it is recommended by most internal auditors that general reserves at year end are normally kept at around 50% of the annual precept amount. So, all importantly, moving on now to calculating the precept. It's not essential for councils to keep their precept at the same level, as sometimes new projects and facilities need to be accounted for. Sometimes it may be essential that the project will need to be increased, the precept, may need to be increased due to the previous budget not being fit for purpose, or the council needing to take on some additional services. So how do councils calculate their precept? A precept requirement takes into consideration all expenditure required, less any predicted income for the and the remaining amount is normally what should be precepted for. So for example, if the council's overall expenditure budget is 15,000 and they have an expected income of around 5,000, the precept requirement to be submitted to the billing authority would be for about £10,000. So that's taken into consideration the expenditure and then less the income to get to that figure. This precept amount is then divided by the tax base figure. That is sent to your clerk from your local billing authority around now, if not sooner. A tax-based figure is the number of Band D equivalent homes that are paying council tax in your town or village. So for a precept of, say, around £5,000 with a tax base of 110.29, this would then result in an annual charge of £45.34 to each household for the parish council's element of the council tax bill. How I've got to that calculation is I've taken the proposed precept, which in this case is £5,000. I've then looked at my tax base figure received from my district council, which is 110.29 in this example, and then divided that by that. So it's £5,000 divided by 110.29, and that gets us to an annual charge of £45.34. This is Band D. You can then break that down to monthly, even weekly if you wanted to, when you present this to council. If your council has decided to increase its precept by a vast amount, the increase in the annual charge for the council's element may need to be justified to local residents. It's usually a good idea to put a brief statement as to why the precept has been increased on the council's website and in the newsletter too. That's if you have one. Monitoring the budget. So the budget process is looking closely at all expected income and expenditure items for the following year, taking into account what has been spent on those items over the last few years to achieve your correct precept amount. It's a good idea to monitor your budget throughout the year, as this can then assist you with predicting any underspends or overspends. Keeping track of your budget throughout the year is a good exercise to help when preparing for future budgets, and keeps the council informed of their current spending and if the budget amounts approved were adequate. So this brings me to the end of today's presentation. I hope you have found today's session useful, and I would be happy, along with my colleague Hannah, to take any questions at all. Thank you.
Thanks, Jo. So if anyone's got any questions, you're
welcome.
In the chat, or I can maybe look if anyone's waving at me. No. Oh, sorry, someone waved there. Was that you, Kevin? Were you waving?
Yeah.
Hello, hi.
Hi, you work on a fixed budget. Does that mean it can't be changed halfway through the year? If there's a sudden increase and you know it's going to be permanent, can you change the budget halfway through the year?
Yeah, like when your clerk does quarterly budget updates, if you've had like some underspends on certain things and there's a remainder left, you can move that budget heading across if you want to. So you might say, oh, we've got like £500 left in that, but we're having an overspend. You can, it has to be approved in council or like a finance committee, but you can move your budgets about. There's nothing like saying that it's fixed, whereas like, you know, there's differences when it comes to reserves and things. But with your budget, if you've got an underspend, there's no reason why you can't put that amount that's left over into another heading.
Right, okay, thank you.
No, you're welcome.
Okay, any other questions? Nope, sorry, I have to scroll through everyone's pictures just to check no one's waving at me.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, well, thank you all for joining us today. If you do have any other questions, please do get in contact with us at hello@scribeaccounts.com. As I said, we'll send out a copy of the slides and a recording of the session to everyone after presentation's finished. Hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you on future training sessions. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks everyone for coming. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.